Hello and welcome to the award-winning Tough Girl podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Williams. Today, I'm thrilled to announce a special collaboration with Innovate, a world-renowned and ambitious sportswear pioneer. Innovate will be sponsoring the Tough Girl podcast throughout the month of June, with new episodes going live every Tuesday and Thursday at 7 a.m. UK time. Innovate is a UK-based company, and it is their mission to empower the world's physical and mental fitness through more fulfilling sporting experiences. I've been wearing Innovate trainers and sportswear since 2019 on all my adventures and challenges around the world. Most recently over in New Zealand while I walked the Tiara Trail, and in Spain when I was on the Camino Viva de la Plata. With Innovate's support, I'm able to continue showcasing incredible female role models who take on adventures and physical challenges. Stay tuned for an incredible episode filled with stories, insights, top tips and advice to motivate and inspire you. To find out more about Innovate, visit the Tough Girl website or search Innovate Sportswear online. You can also use the discount code ToughGirl15, ToughGirl15 to get 15% off your next order.
My name is Sunny Stroeer. I am a professional adventure athlete and guide service owner. I'm based in southern Utah. And it's been about 4 years since we've spoken.
So we spoke on June 23rd, 2020. But in that episode, we find out more about you, your early years, how you got into running, how you didn't enjoy it at first. You talk more about studying politics, loving adventure books, being inspired by your mum, falling in love with running. You talk more about, sort of leaving your corporate job, dealing with van life, climbing mountains. Oh, there's so much we talk about. We talk about your 360-degree challenge in Aconcagua, running around the mountain and up to the summit and then back down again, which was 104 kilometers, which you did in 47 hours when you became the first one to do it. So absolutely amazing, incredible episode to listen to. But what I want to do is almost jump back actually to 2020 to catch up on what you've been up to for the past couple of years, because you are an adventure athlete. You do travel a lot. So yeah, what happened in 2020? Like how were things for you?
Oh, it was wild. I mean, with the pandemic, my husband and I actually had been in a transitionary period at that time, and we were just getting ready to pull the trigger on buying a tour company, a guide service in southern Utah in late 2019, early 2020. And so we were doing our due diligence over the holidays, over the new year, and then we signed the purchase agreement on March 6th, 2020, and bought a guide service. And then 10 days later, the borders shut down and we shut down, and COVID was just absolutely rampant. So that was an exciting period of time for a little while. It took us, a couple months to really know that the decision that we had made was an okay one. To start with, we were essentially staring bankruptcy in the face, immediately after buying the business. So that was really scary.
How did you handle that? Like, that sounds like mentally, emotionally, like all the emotions going through the ringer.
So my background is strategy consulting, right? Back in my 20s, and I have an MBA from Harvard and all of those things. And then I'd been out on the road, just adventuring full time and being a content creator and a professional adventure athlete, which I really loved and still love. But it was very interesting, in 2019, 2020, when my husband and I made that transition, in some ways it actually felt like all of my various skills all of a sudden were coming together and were getting called upon. And so in a strange way, it was actually really satisfying and really exciting, to be honest. It was scary as well because, of course, we didn't want to be dead in the water. We didn't want to go bankrupt, but it was a different type of challenge at the time. And it was scary. It was incredibly uncertain. It was incredibly unpredictable. But in some ways, that's what I thrive in the outdoors, right? And I actually kind of was thriving on it as well in my office.
Were you still doing your own sort of personal adventures at this point? Were you able to get out? Were you able to do the types of fitness that you enjoy doing?
Yes and no. So I continued to pursue my own adventures, and that was actually a hugely important thing for me. And, trying to figure out where I wanted to direct my career. I wanted to make sure that I'm my own boss and I have all the time to go after big adventures and, kind of big missions like I had for the last almost a decade now, I guess. At the same time, because it was COVID, of course, it wasn't appropriate to go out and, travel internationally and do these big things that are way out there and super risky and, incredibly remote. So no, I didn't maintain things at the same level as when you and I last spoke. However, because I live in southern Utah and there is just so much amazing scenery and landscape and adventure out here and so few people. We actually didn't have any cases of COVID until I think July 2020 or something like that. And, nobody was traveling. So while the place was empty, I got to go and play and explore and, pursue fastest known times and speed records in my backyard and, just really be out there and kind of learn the land around me here. So that was satisfying in its own way. It wasn't what it had been up until 2020, but then thankfully, with the first year of the pandemic kind of blowing through, I was able to pick things up again. And I actually ended up, kind of refocusing my energies towards Alaska and started adventuring in Alaska pretty early on after the pandemic in 2021.
Ooh, tell us more about Alaska. What were you doing out there?
Well, so Alaska, the first big adventure that I had after the pandemic was what's called the Iditarod Trail Invitational. And I participated in a 350-mile race up in the winter of Alaska on skis because, my kind of big idea, big dream is that eventually I think I'd like to try to do some speed work at the South Pole, but I'm not a cross-country skier. So, I'm like, okay, if I'd like to ski really fast to the South Pole and I don't know how to ski, what's the best way for me to learn? Well, let's go and find some sort of a shorter event race, something that's supported, something that has infrastructure that kind of mimics a little bit of the same environment and the same activity. And I found the Iditarod Trail Invitational where you have that, extreme cold, far out there, cross country skiing for miles and miles and miles and miles and days and days and days and days. And I participated in the short version of the event for the first time, and when was that? March 2021.
Was this like self-supported? Were there check-in posts? Was this non-stop? Were you, I'm literally about to say like wild camping or bivvying like in this weather? What did that actually like look like?
It's a great question. And the Iditarod Trail Invitational, which by the way, I'll talk about it as the ITI because otherwise it's a mouthful, right? So the ITI is a supported race. There are a couple of checkpoints along the way, but the distances are massive, right? And you are in Alaska in the middle of nowhere in the winter. And so for the 350-mile version, there are two versions of this race. There's 350 miles and there's a 1,000-mile version. For the short version, you are out for a maximum of 10 days. That's the race cutoff. And you start kind of right off the road system near Anchorage, but then you just push into the backcountry. You go and you travel along these remote rivers. You go through the Alaska Range a little bit south of Denali. You go through the interior of Alaska where you can't get to unless you're either flying or in the summer you have a boat, or, you're one of the crazies who does it under their own power, either on skis or on foot or on a fat bike, or you're a dog musher, right? So it's very, very remote. And while there are checkpoints here and there, they're kind of spaced, anywhere between 20 to 75 miles apart. So you have a lot of time on your own in between. And something that I love about this race is that there is no, survival gear, no kind of mandatory kit list that you can go off. It's entirely up to you what you want to bring. And so a couple of people choose to, travel super light, particularly if they're moving in a fast kind of mode of travel. So there's some people who do it on a fat bike and they can potentially cover 350 miles in, 3-4 days or even faster. Like it's crazy how fast those bikes can go. But the bikers may not carry anything. They may carry like a big jacket and some heavy gloves and not even bring a sleeping bag because they just bank on being able to go from checkpoint to checkpoint and to always be indoors. And then there's me, I was traveling on cross-country skis and my average pace was like, probably 2.5 miles an hour. So on a good day. So I knew that I had to bring everything. I had to bring a sleeping bag. I had to bring equipment to camp out. I had to be able to go and melt snow to make my own water because I could not bank on being fast enough to go checkpoint to checkpoint. And, again, Alaska in the winter, the temperatures get down to -40, -50 degrees, which is about, just really, really, really cold.
I'm literally sat here with my jaw open. So I know that this was like a little bit of a tester, a trial, almost like your first sort of experience doing I love it where I'm like the short version of 350 miles. But, reflecting back on that, what were the key lessons that you learned? Because this was like a recce for the bigger race, wasn't it?
It absolutely was. And as a matter of fact, there's a funny story here. So, again, I was drawn to the ITI because I figured it was really good preparation for me to eventually get ready for the South Pole. And I spoke to the race director at the time. Now, the ITI is called the Iditarod Trail Invitational because it's kind of a big deal. And, it's a very hard race. And so you have to qualify. You have to go and do all of these prerequisites. And then you have to apply. And then only a handful of the applicants actually get invited to participate, right? So there's a reason that it's an invitational. However, I did not have any of the qualifiers or kind of, standard prerequisites because I was completely new to the world of winter ultra racing. Now, of course, I've done many other things. And, we spoke previously about me running around and to the top of Aconcagua and back, things like that, where I know how to deal with extreme cold. I know how to deal with, really long efforts and being really remote and all of that. So I applied. Well, actually, I didn't apply. I reached out to the race director directly saying, hey, I'm not qualified to do this, but I would really like to. Here are the other things that I've done. Would you let me in, please? In her credit, the race director at the time said, you know what? Let's talk about it. Let's meet. And then she said, okay, fine. Yep. That all sounds good. I am going to allow you to participate in the race and you're going to go and do the short distance, right? The 350. And I actually came back and said, well, thank you. I appreciate you letting me in. However, I really don't want to do the 350. I want to do the 1,000-mile version, which is the big kahuna out in Alaska, right? I want to do the 1,000-mile race because if I'm coming up there, I'm putting in all this effort, money, time, preparation, everything to try and get ready for this. I'm clearing my calendar. Why don't you just let me try to do the entire thing? And she's like, no, sorry. We don't let anybody try for the 1,000 unless you have finished a 350-mile race at least once, if not twice. And anyway, so I tried to argue my case multiple times and she was completely firm. She was like, nope, you're welcome to do the 350, but there's no way you're not going to go and get permission to do the 1,000. So I finally grudgingly said, okay, fine, let me do the 350. I was a little bit disappointed because I figured, in the 350, you do have aid stations every, as I said, like 25 to or 30 to 75 miles, and you have other competitors and you have a bit of support and, everything. And I just kind of figured that with that sort of infrastructure that it would be relatively straightforward to do that race.
Yeah.
Because think about it. 350 miles, 10 days, that's 35 miles a day. Yeah, that's a lot, but it's not, it's not crazy. Like you don't have to be fast to do this. You just have to be enduring and smart to do it, right? So I wasn't really stoked on just doing the 350. However, I signed up for it and then I was waiting for an email that would have the athlete handbook and the mandatory gear list and all of those things, right? And none of that ever came. And I'm like, wait a second, what's going on here? So I reached out again to the race director and I was like, thanks for letting me in, but how about, I haven't gotten any emails from you. Is there any communication? And we found out that actually I legitimately hadn't been on their mailing list. So that was an oversight. I got added, but then I asked for the mandatory gear list and the answer that I got was like, oh, no, there is none. If you do this, if you get invited to do this race, we assume that you know what you're doing. So whatever you want to bring, you can bring. And at that point, I was like, oh boy, because I realized now that really I had no business being there. I had no idea, no clue what type of gear actually would keep me safe in that type of environment. And as soon as I understood that this was really truly like my own responsibility of making things happen versus just going by an athlete handbook and kind of checking the boxes and, getting it done, my attitude towards that race changed radically.
So how much time did you have between signing up for the race and actually doing the race? Talk us through more around that planning and preparation. Did you work with a coach? Did you have a mentor? Were you able to speak with any other people who'd done this race before?
Yeah, I had no coach. I did have and do have several mentors at this point, and they're all race veterans. And I have to say the community is just absolutely amazing. Everybody who goes and gets engaged in this race just tends to end up, being really deep in the community and being happy to share and volunteer with future racers. So I was thankfully able to connect with a couple of folks who'd done the race before and really just, relied on the generosity of those people who spend hours and hours and hours with me on the phone and on Zoom going through, the race route and going through the gear and what gear worked for them and what gear didn't work for them. And, one of the challenges is that they're really, because it's such a kind of far out there event and such a specialty event, it's not like, say, setting a speed record in trail running somewhere where you kind of know what your kit is going to be like, on average. For the ITI, everybody tinkers with their gear and people do all sorts of different things. And there are 3 different modes of travel, by the way. There's a whole skiing, doing it on foot and doing it on fat bike. And so, what works for a fat biker obviously isn't going to work for a foot racer necessarily, right? So there's all of that. And there are very, very few people who ever ski the event. So even though I could piece a lot of advice together from veterans and folks that had done the race previously, a lot of it was, also taking that information, trying to really absorb and kind of digest that, and then overlaying it with my own experiences from mountaineering and from other adventures and saying, well, I think I'm going to do this differently and we'll just see how it goes. But it was incredibly nerve-wracking. And as a matter of fact, typically I talk about my adventures a fair amount on social media, right? But with the ITI, when I did that 350 version the first year, I was so quiet about it. And I barely said anything about even, just going up to Alaska and trying to do this because I felt so out of my depth. And I was scared, to be honest, that I was going to completely embarrass myself in some ways, and not even just embarrass myself, but that I was going to show up there and just like go down in flames within the first couple hours of the first day of the race and have to look back on it and be like, well, yeah, duh, that wasn't smart. Of course you don't know how to do this.
You're such a confident, strong, experienced adventurer, explorer. And actually, even just to say that, feeling out of your depth, that must have made you sort of feel very uncomfortable, because it's almost like you're leaving your comfort zone, and your comfort zone is massive, and entering that more like that stretch zone. And just like, how did you deal with those feelings, which maybe you actually haven't had for quite a number of years?
You're completely correct, Sarah. I mean, that was a very new to me mindset at the time and very different. And, part of it was that, as I said, I didn't really talk very much about it because I kind of wanted to figure this out privately before sharing it with the world, right? Because I thought that there was such a big risk of me just showing up there and not being able to do anything really, and like getting my butt kicked and just having to drop out within the first couple of miles. But in general, I'll say that I really like that feeling of humility and of uncertainty and of not knowing how things are going to go, and of, kind of getting that pucker factor and being like, oh, wow, how will I deal with that? So in some ways, when I heard that there wasn't any mandatory kit list that I could go off, that actually made me embrace the race a lot more and take it way more seriously, but also get way more excited about it. And it was a really weird dichotomy, because on the one hand, it was incredibly scary, and on the other hand, it was incredibly exciting. And so that is kind of a place where I actually really enjoy spending time. So it was a perfect match.
So take us back to your first experience, and was it what you expected?
Well, I'd say I had minimal expectations. I had no idea what things were going to be like. I just didn't know. And I was learning all of these new things and terms, like, for example, dealing with overflow. So, something that you do on the Iditarod trail, the trail only exists in the winter, right? It's a seasonal trail. It's only passable in the winter because you go and you travel along all of these frozen water courses, like rivers, lakes, across swamps, and you actually go across the sea ice eventually in the 1,000-mile distance as well. So you're on a lot of kind of temporary surface that doesn't exist or isn't passable for anything other than boats in the summer. And something that I learned, researching and trying to get ready for the first race was that even though the ice is generally very, very solid and there's a low risk of breaking through the ice and getting in the water, that can happen. But, that usually is an issue. But there is something called overflow where, the ice on the rivers is solid. But because you have weather changes and, you have the ice moving around, you have pressure changes and whatever else, you end up getting cracks in the ice. And then the water underneath pushes up onto the surface off the ice and floods it. Okay. So the river is both frozen and flooded at the same time. And that's a phenomenon that happens quite a lot. And at times, you have to figure out a way to get through that overflow as a racer. And of course, you don't want to get wet if the temperatures are, in the -30, -40, -50 range. If you get wet, you're in deep trouble, right? So things like that, it was just like, it was mind blowing to me to try and wrap my head around, like, how does this work and what does this actually mean? And, what should I even be scared of? Do I need to be scared of, moose? Do I need to be scared of wolves? Do I need to be scared of going further up to Nome than on the 1,000-mile version? Do I need to be scared of polar bears? The answer on the latter one, thankfully, is no. But, just trying to wrap my head around like all of the different elements that are out there and that are challenging was really, really difficult. And in some ways, just getting to the start line and saying, okay, I feel confident enough in the conversations that I've had and in the kit that I've put together and in what I'm carrying with me on my sled and in my backpack to just set out and see how it goes, and just make it to the next aid station, right? That's all that I got to do. I only got to do 25 miles or so, or I only got to do 50 miles, and then I'll have an indoor opportunity, and then I can assess how things are going, and I can see if I'm good enough to continue on. That was it was a gradual process, and it dealt with a lot of kind of embracing not just discomfort, but that mental questioning of, can I do this? Can I keep myself safe? And that was really exciting and nerve-wracking.
We're definitely going to delve into the physical, the mental, the nutrition, and we'll link that into the 1,000-miler that you've done recently. But the one thing I just want to clarify, though, is I'm assuming that you've got or had a background in skiing. Have you skied before?
Not really. Not at all, actually. I mean, that was part of the reason that I wanted to do the ITI, because even I am smart enough to understand that if I want to ski to the South Pole, I can't just show up as a rookie on skis, right? And be like, oh, I'm going to do this and just try to get it done. So I knew that I had to learn to ski. And now, in all fairness, I do have a background in downhill skiing. So at least I know what it feels like to have sticks on my feet, all right? I'm not a complete klutz when it comes to the actual skis, but I'm not a cross-country skier at all. I had cross-country skied maybe, I don't know, half a dozen times in my life. And the last time before the first ITI probably was when I was, I don't know, 13 or 14 years old. And then I did not get my skis for the ITI until about 3 weeks before the race. So yeah, this was all very, very new to me.
So you finished your first ITI, you finished the 350 miler back in, so that was February 2021?
Correct, yes.
Was there a lot of changes that you needed to make after you did the 350?
Yes. The lesson that I learned in that first year, well, the first lesson was that, yes, I can do this and I can, at some level keep myself safe in those types of extreme conditions for that long. But I also got my butt kicked so badly. I mean, I had paired up with another racer and, we were traveling together quite a lot, but we were sleeping out and bivvying in the open all the time. We were making fires all the time because we were way too cold and, needed to dry things out. We ended up, like, I barely finished with, I think, 25 minutes on the clock. And my partner, Sarah, that I teamed up with, she actually had to drop out about 50 miles from the finish. So it was just a desperate race against the clock for most of the event. And I learned so many things about, what not to do, how not to be sweating out there, how not to get wet, how to organize my gear, how to, try and be efficient, how to sleep and all of those things. So I had a really, really tough year, the first year. And as a matter of fact, I think, the last 24 hours pulling into that finish, I was so strung out. I remember, I was moving very, very slow at this point. Actually, one of the bindings of my skis had broken. So I didn't have proper skis anymore. And the binding broke at mile 200. So I still had another 150 miles to go, right? And I decided that even though my skis were now out of the question, I wanted to finish the race. I didn't want to drop out. And what I should say is I had rigged my own kind of special setup where I was wearing soft, comfortable hiking boots. And I had used those with universal bindings on my cross-country skis. So, one of the reasons that I'd done that is that, one, I deal with a lot of foot pain and I didn't want to be in a ski boot for 10 days. But also in the ITI, you actually have a lot of like small terrain changes that just aren't skiable. So it's a lot of skis on, skis off, skis on, skis off. And then you have to walk your skis. And then there's areas where you have like 40 miles where there's no snow. So you have to go and hike everything, right? So I didn't want to deal with having to switch over shoes and like bring a separate pair of shoes to be able to hike. So I just figured out a way to have my hiking shoes in universal bindings on those skis. But long story short, my binding broke at mile 200. And I said, okay, well, that's not good. However, I do have comfortable boots on and I know how to hike. So I guess I'm just going to go and hike the last 150 miles, right? So I strapped my skis on my back and carried them and hiked the last 150 miles. But now in the last 24 hours trying to push to that first finish, the conditions were really rough. It was very, very wet. There had been a lot of fresh snow. It was kind of warm. And so the trail wasn't firm at all. I was kind of sinking in and post-holing and trying to just get through there just on foot now without any flotation. And it got to a point where I was in this swamp that was so deep and there was just no way for me to make it through on foot. So I was trying to will my ski binding back into functioning and to try to figure out how to just get a little bit more use out of my skis because I legitimately couldn't connect back to the main trail without having some form of some way to not, post hole and punch through super deep. So that was exhausting, but also, I'm traveling so slow. I was so tired. And I just remember I'm going across a super deep section. I'm worried about physically not being able to break trail there. And it was dark and I was running out of time and the clock's running out. I'm by myself. I'm like one of the very last people in the field, which by the way is a common theme. We'll get back to that in 1000. And I didn't have time to stop and, eat or drink really or, get a hot meal or anything like that. But I desperately needed caffeine. So the last thing that I had was a couple of instant coffee packs. So I literally just dumped them on my tongue to try and get the caffeine directly and, just swallowed the granules. It worked for about 45 minutes and then I still crashed entirely and I had to sleep for just a little while. But again, I'm looking at the clock and literally the seconds are ticking away. And I'm like, every minute that I sleep is a minute that makes me less likely to finish. Long story short, I did eventually finish. I did make it. I came to the finish line completely, run ragged, completely soaked. It had been raining on me at this point. It had really warmed up a lot. And just, at the very limit of what I could do physically and emotionally. And even though I'm finishing this race, just looking like a complete mess and feeling like a hot mess. Before I had even crossed the finish line, I already knew that I was coming back to do this again because it was so powerful and so transformative and so difficult, but in a really, just magical way. It was the right level of difficulty. It was pushing me so hard, but I was still just barely, I felt like within kind of the expanded boundary of my comfort zone where I wasn't going into panic mode, but I was just in continuous growth, which I really, really enjoyed. So yeah, first race, I finished with barely any time on the clock to spare. And I knew that I was coming back the next year and making a bunch of changes, learning a lot of lessons from that first year. And so I ended up coming back actually 2 more times. I returned in 2022 to ski it again. And I skied it in better style with more experience, with, my gear a little bit more dialed without a binding that broke and finished that race. And then I came back in 2023 and actually fat biked the short version with my husband, Paul, which was also a really magical adventure. And it was only after those 3 short finishes in the 350-mile distance that I finally committed to attempting the 1,000-mile version on skis.
I really like that because it's progression and also it's being, as boring as this sounds, it's actually been really sensible because these environments, they can be scary and dangerous and you make little mistakes. You might lose a finger or a toe or, the end of your nose or something, a lot can happen. So I love that journey of progression. So we're going to skip ahead the 2 years from this, the second time you did it and, fast biking with hubby in 2023 to 2024 to this year.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Talk me through your strategy. Talk me through your plan. This is a different kettle of fish now because it's, 350, you're jumping ahead to 1,000 miles. almost three times the length, or just over three times the length. What was the mindset? What was the strategy going in? What was your plan? You also, so sorry, lots of questions in here, but I'll try and keep it concise. So you had a cutoff point of 10 days for the 350. Was there a cutoff point for the 1,000 miler? And yeah, what was your strategy? What was your plan?
There was a cutoff point for the 1,000 milers. You get 30 days to finish the race all the way to Nome, which, they call it 1,000 miles. Depending on the year and depending on the route, it's typically somewhere between 930 and 960 miles. So it's not quite 1,000, but close enough. I'll call it 1,000 just for simplicity's sake here. My strategy for this was, well, it was both ad hoc and thought through in various elements. So a couple of things that happened. First up, I'd finished those other three short distances now the previous 3 years, and I felt like I was more comfortable with the overall environment out there, with the challenges that you're facing, with the gear, with keeping myself warm. So that I felt like I had a better handle on. However, I also knew that for the 1,000-mile version, I really, really wanted to make sure that I showed up in, top physical shape, because to do the 1,000, you're looking at, what is that, 32 miles a day on average. And unfortunately, it's just kind of a given that there's going to be various days where you can't actually put down a lot of miles because, either of weather or because, you're just exhausted, you need a rest day, or because something's going wrong or whatever it may be, so you have to budget in that there's going to be some shorter days, which means that on average, you're probably skiing a lot more than 32 miles a day, and you're doing that day after day after day after day without any chance to recover. So going into this race very strong, I thought, was incredibly important. And I unfortunately ended up with a stress fracture on my shin in December. So I wasn't able to train. That now meant, the race started in late February. So I'm looking at December off my feet, rehab time, January mostly off my feet, not a lot of physical training. And then I had like the last 2 weeks in January and 3 weeks in February to try and actually, put the training in to be at a level where I felt ready for skiing 1,000 miles through Alaska. And as you can imagine, 5 weeks are not enough to prepare for something like that. So I already had that stressor of knowing, okay, I'm going to go into this with subpar physical training and like cardio preparation. Given that, and given that I can't change anything about that, what is within my control and what can I do? Right. So I spend a ton of time thinking about my gear, really optimizing my gear, trying to be as light as possible, thinking about, do I take a sled or do I take a backpack, for example? Because here's the thing, when you go to Nome, as I said, there's no mandatory kit list, but there are certain elements that you just kind of know you have to have if you want to survive, right? You need a really good sleeping bag. I carried a negative 40-degree bag. You need a stove system. You need, food, water, you need fuel, you need, whatever it may be. And so I had dialed in my kit and was trying to be very light, but very light. And this sort of setup still means about probably 35 to 40 pounds, maybe a little bit more on days where you have to be really loaded with food because there's no resupply for a couple days down the trail. How do you deal with that much weight for that type of distance? Now, if you were through hiking, it wouldn't be that big a deal, right? Because 35, 40 pounds, yeah, it's heavy, but it's manageable. On skis, it's a little bit difficult because if you pull a sled, that makes things a lot more energy efficient for me personally anyway, as far as not having to carry quite so heavy. But with a sled, you really don't have much kick and glide on cross-country skis. It's kind of like you're just hauling an anchor right behind you that's just hauling you back at every step. And you're certainly not going to be skate skiing. You'll have a hell of a time going up, across hills. And, so that's not ideal. So the other alternative is, okay, now you bring a backpack instead of a sled so you don't have to deal with that anchor issue. With the backpack, though, if you have 40 pounds in your backpack and you're skiing potentially up to, well, I was hoping I was going to be skiing on average 15 hours a day. Realistically, most days I was probably skiing 16 or 17 hours, and there were days where I was skiing as many as 20 or 21 hours. So if you spend that much time awake and on your feet and with that sort of weight on your back, it's just exhausting, right? It is so exhausting. So how do you try and combine the best of those two elements? I ended up choosing to do both sled and pack so that I could shift weight back and forth between the two and kind of take advantage of the various benefits that each of the systems had, depending on what terrain I was in, depending on how tired I was, yada, yada, yada. So my preparation was very much focused on just trying to get my gear, to get my system systems really dialed, be as light as possible, and be as strategically set up with my gear as possible.
That's so clever. I really like that. The fact that you can move that weight around depending on, where you are, what's going on. There's the element of cold. Actually, it's the two things I hate the most. It's the element of being cold, but there's also a problem of getting like wet. Like if you're, because even like walking through, wet and cold in the -30, -40 degree, that can be very, very dangerous. So like, how do you manage that? Especially like if you're, trying not to sweat, but you're still getting wet, just even from like your body heat, but maybe from the external elements as well. What are you doing for the cold and the wet?
Yeah, you're completely right, Sarah. The wet part is the most dangerous thing out there in an effort like this. So it's incredibly important to try and not sweat, which of course, you can't just tell your body to not sweat, but essentially what it means is regulating down your layering and being on the colder side most of the time, so making sure that your pace is matched with what you're wearing. And even though, you may be out in -20 degrees, if you're moving, you may not be wearing anything other than a soft shell, right? Because it's really, really dangerous to get hot and to have moisture in your clothing. Once you have moisture on your clothes, you have to find a way to dry that out again at the end of the day. Ideally, if you have indoor access, that's by far the easiest. If you can just put it in front of a heater, or if there's a safety cabin where you can build a fire and you have a stove, if you can put it near the stove, that's usually the easiest and most straightforward way. But then, if there's sections where you have 150 miles or so without indoor access, if your stuff is wet, it's really, really difficult. Like you either have to build a fire and then sit there and, wait and make sure that you're not actually burning holes into your things as they're drying out. Or you have an option of drying things in your sleeping bag overnight, but that's not very comfortable, and it's also not very fast, right? So it's really difficult to keep stuff dry. For me, in general, I try to be really, really good about just traveling relatively slowly, which, happened to work very well with my suboptimal level of training anyway. But so I was trying to really keep my heart rate low, not push myself as far as like in the moment physical cardio output, and also be layered down so that, I just wasn't running all that hot and I wasn't sweating. And that worked pretty well for the most part. But the one thing where it didn't work well for me, and that I think is, for me, it's the most vulnerable part, is my hands and my gloves. I had a pretty decent glove system, I thought, but even if you're moving at a low heart rate, your gloves just, they become damp over a couple hours. It is what it is, just from your hands being in there. I have not found a way to effectively prevent moisture from getting into my gloves. And so for the stretches where I was out there for days on end without being able to get indoors and without being able to dry things out, I would, I just had a bunch of different pairs of gloves and I would circle them through. And as soon as one got a little damp, I would go and switch into another liner glove. And then I would try and dry out that first pair of liner gloves on my body while I was moving, like on my stomach or in my armpits. And truth be told, it wasn't working great. So the one time where I wasn't able to get indoors for about 150 miles or so, almost 200 miles, I was really grateful when I finally finished that stretch, because I had gotten to a point where I did not have a single pair of gloves anymore that still was dry. And so I was just cycling through kind of damp and moist gloves in -40 degrees with hand warmers, stuffed into the gloves and attached to my poles, trying to keep my hands operating and warm and safe. But I did get a little bit of frostbite in that section, actually.
How are your feet?
Interestingly enough, my feet were actually really good from a temperature perspective. And I mentioned earlier, I was using a pretty unconventional footwear and binding system. I had universal bindings that you can use with any boots. And I was wearing soft Loa winter hiking boots, and they're specifically the Renegade Ice Evo Gore-Tex, I think is what they call that model. And it's like a winter, single, like nicely lined hiking boot. Super soft, super comfortable. And I was warm in that down to -50 degrees and had no issues at all, even while I was getting frostbite on my fingers. So I was very, very pleased with that. From a temperature perspective, feet were really good. However, spending that much time on my feet, as I said, it was somewhere between, 14 to 20 hours a day on average that I was spending skiing with that repetitive motion, of kind of, being in the skis and essentially almost being on tracks. There's very little variation in movement, not like hiking or running. Like you're repeating the same motion over and over and over again. And I did walk away with very numb heels, even just after the first, I think, 7 or 8 days, which is different from what had happened to me in previous years. That hadn't been as much of an issue. I'm not sure why, this year I was really feeling that numbness. But yeah, so I think I did some nerve damage, and it's now, about 6 weeks or so after I finished the race, and I still have slightly numb heels, but it's gotten a lot better, and I think they're coming back.
Talk us through some of the highlights, some of the those magical moments. Talk us through some of the, just maybe life on the trail and what that looked like for you.
There were so many of them. And truth be told, at the same time, so few as well, because when you think about it, 30 days, 30 nights, it's a long time. And covering, 40, 50 miles a day, you're just out there. And the landscape is changing and it's variable and it's beautiful, but it's changing at a very slow pace, right? Just like through hiking, you're traveling at such slow speeds that, at times it feels like you're moving at a glacial pace. And one of the things that stuck with me and that was really beautiful and liberating for me in some ways was that, I had my iPhone along. Of course, I took a bunch of photos and video, and I had things set up so that I could listen to podcasts like this one, and I could listen to audiobooks and music when things got rough, distract myself. But I found myself on many days just starting to ski and kind of looking up 14 hours later and being like, oh, wow, I just hit that ski and I wouldn't have listened to anything. I wouldn't have talked to anybody. I would have just been in the moment and in my own thoughts for 14 hours or more. And that mindfulness and that presence, that really was a massive highlight for me and something that I don't get to enjoy in daily life. And it's a big reason why I do these things. So that was a huge one. But I know you're asking, I think, about, kind of the interactions and the landscapes and the moments and kind of the things that are Alaska about this adventure, right? Rather the things that are me internally about this adventure. A couple things that stand out. So one, I saw a wolverine, which is really cool and really rare. And I'm really excited that I got to spot a wolverine on one of the trails at dusk, just way out, in the hills of Alaska. So that was really, really cool. Something else that was amazing was actually the day that I left McGrath, which is the finish line for the short distance, for the 350-mile distance. I was now pushing into unknown terrain and kind of setting out on the trail in an area that was completely new to me. And it just so happened that the Iditarod sled dog race was also passing through that region at the same time because, the dogs race on the exact same trail. That's why it's called the Iditarod. And they start about a week after us human-powered racers, but they travel much faster. So the dogs only take about 8 to 10 days, I think, to make it all the way up to Nome, where for me, it took a full 30 days, right? So they caught up to me right as I had left the short finish line in McGrath. And, I'm now in new terrain. I'm skiing through these beautiful hills. I had to do some really hard and big climbing, actually, but then was rewarded by this beautiful, gentle, nice downhill that went on for just miles and miles and miles and miles. And the sun was setting and the sky was beautiful. It was just on fire and all lit up. And I was feeling good because I'd just taken a rest day at McGrath and the trail was in great condition. So I was skiing along at I think 5 or 6 miles an hour, which for me is incredibly fast. And I was just really loving life. And then the dog teams are coming by, there's one probably every hour and a half or so. And it's just magical to see the dogs running and smiling and, kind of watch them just zoom by so quietly because all that you hear is, their breathing and the kind of tapping of their paws. And at one point, one of the mushers who was kind of towards the back of the field, she was a gal that was probably a couple of years younger than me. And she gave me, a nice, advanced holler because the thing is the trails are pretty narrow, right? You can imagine they're kind of single or double track trails essentially. And you have to be on the trail where it's hard packed. As soon as you go off the trail, you're in super deep snow where you can't make any progress. So, whenever there was a dog team coming by, I'd have to get off the trail to make space for them because the dogs would just keep running. So this musher, kind of yelled because she was a couple hundred yards behind me, gave me a heads up that she was coming. I get my sled out of the way, I grab my camera, I take some pictures and some footage of her. And as she's coming in, she's like, "Hey, do you want some food?" And I was like, "Yeah, of course I do." And, just on the fly, she like grabs this, whatever, snack pack thing and throws it over to me. And, it was just, I don't know, it was so cool. So that was a definite highlight. And then that happened again in different capacity, not with the mushers, but the race director actually is a pilot and has a small plane. And so he was traveling the race course by plane while I was on the Yukon River, which, the course stays on the Yukon for about 135 miles or so. The race director flew over and buzzed me and dropped off a care package that included cheese and meat sticks and chocolate and Fireball whiskey. And yeah, that was pretty cool.
What type of food and nutrition are you having on the trail? Like, are you snack eating all the time? Like, are you having 2 breakfasts, 2 lunch, 2 dinners? What does that look like?
I was snack eating all the time. And then when I wasn't skiing, I was eating as much as I humanly could in as short a period of time as possible. So, I had mailed ahead boxes and resupplies for further up the trail with freeze-dried meals to eat in the mornings and the nights, and lots and lots of sports nutrition goop type of products for during the day. But I also took advantage of any time there was an outside opportunity to get extra food. So the way the ITI works, by the way, is, you have a couple of checkpoints, but there's only, I think, maybe 3 or 4 checkpoints that are actually provided by the race. And then there are a couple of lodges and not Airbnbs, B&Bs along the way where you can buy accommodation and you can buy food at your own leisure. And, whenever that opportunity popped up, I would just, eat whatever I could and order all the meals. So there was this one B&B, for example, in Galena, which is a small native village along the Yukon River. And this guy, Larry, was running it. I got there late in the night and Larry was up and offering me dinner and made me breakfast for dinner, actually. And he said, "Okay, how many eggs do you want in your omelet?" And I was like, "Well, how many do you have?" And he's like, "I got about 10. I'm like, "Okay, so I'll do a 10-egg omelet." And then I chased that with 4 pancakes and then I did it again the next morning. So yeah, as many calories as possible.
With like the accommodation and stuff, did you book that in advance, or have you got, because oh my God, I think I'd cry if I was getting to like knew that there was going to be like going through like a little town to get like accommodation and it was like, "Yeah, sorry, we're full."
Yeah, so you don't book it in advance because you don't really know when you're going to be showing up, right? Just like through hiking. However, we all carry GPS communication. And so the kind of best practice is to let folks know when you're about a day out and let them know that you're coming. But what you're talking about is a very real risk. And I was talking about this 200-mile, 150-mile, 200-mile stretch where there was no indoor access. Well, the kind of indoor access right after that was in a village called Ruby. And for what it's worth, all of these villages, they're way out there, they're only accessible by plane or by boat, and they're small and there's not a lot of options in terms of facilities. So we had like a B&B, or we knew that the school was going to be open for us and we could go to the school. Or we had one person who was a trail angel, who opened their house, right? So we knew where to go. But when I reached Ruby, the person who was running a bed and breakfast there, they were involved with the race and they had all these racers coming through, and I had texted her and let her know that I was coming. And she was like, "Yep, great. Door's going to be open. Just come on in whenever." And I arrived at 4 a.m. So everybody is asleep, of course. And I let myself in. Well, it turns out that there were a couple of snow machiners who were traveling through and they had taken up the bunk room. And so that was entirely full. And then there were 2 other racers who were already there and were sleeping on the couch in the family's living room. So for me, I just stumbled in. Nobody was awake. And I'm like, well, I'm indoors. I'm warm. That's great. I'll go and find the bathroom, show myself around the house. I'll find the kitchen, find some water. And then I'm just going to get my sleeping bag back out and, blow up my sleeping pad and crash on the floor of the living room in between everybody else, because that's the only option right now. And all that I care about is being warm and being dry. But then, of course, I got woken up 3 hours later as everybody's having breakfast. And I'm like, okay, great. I'm not actually getting any sleep here.
Tell us more about the final push to the finish line. You do have a deadline, 30 days to get there. Were you feeling under pressure? Were you feeling confident that you were going to get there by the cutoff point?
I was feeling under massive pressure because from the very beginning, I was traveling pretty slow, and that had been my strategy all along. I wasn't trying to race against anyone other than the clock, and my only goal was to try and make it to the finish in just under 30 days. But, think back to the fact that I hadn't really been able to train as much as I wanted to, so I knew that I needed to be smart with my resources and just try to stay healthy and strong enough to be able to continue pushing day after day. I was always at the very back of the field here, and I felt relatively confident in my pace for a long period of time up until I reached the coast roughly. And the coast is at mile 700 or so. You still, have 250 miles ahead. But the issue, once I got to the coast was that you actually have a small section, about 30 miles of trail that goes straight across the Norton Sound. So rather than traveling along the shore, you are literally going straight across the sea ice, cutting off, quite a bit of shoreline, in this bay and just going across the ice. Now, the sea ice is, it's a temporary trail, and I was at the very back of the pack, and there had been some pretty unsettled weather. And it wasn't clear whether or not the sea ice was still going to be passable because people were concerned that it was either going to be flooded or that it might potentially even start breaking up. So trying to get across that was a bit of a nail biter because I was like, well, if the sea ice isn't in, then there's no way I can continue, right? It's just not going to happen. And there are years in the ITI where people don't make it to the finish line because the trail across the Norton Sound is just out, it's flooded or it's melted. That was not ideal. And then I made it across the sea ice right before it started flooding, or actually as it started flooding, I had to wait a little bit. Got to the North Shore, and at this point, I'm about 200 miles from the finish. And then we still, and I say we because I'm now in the proximity of a couple of other racers that were kind of in the back of the field, we still were looking at really, really difficult conditions. And so there was more overflow happening in some of the coastal areas. There were some very warm temperatures that made the trail super difficult. There was some fresh snow that actually buried the trail, and a couple of racers got stuck in one point for like a day or so because the trail just wasn't passable and they had to wait for a snow machine to come through and kind of break trail. And then we had this massive windstorm in the 70 miles right before the finish in Nome. And all of this is happening as, we racers in the back are watching the clock and we're like, okay, 2 days left on the clock, 1 day left on the clock, half a day left on the clock. Like, how's this going to work? So it really was a nail biter all the way to the end. Once I was about 40 miles out from Nome, and I still had, I think, right around 36 hours or so for those last 40 miles. I was like, okay, I'm pretty sure I should be able to do this now. And even at that point, though, the snow conditions were so difficult, I actually ended up having to walk because it was now so warm that the snow was sticking to the bottom of my skis and I couldn't ski anymore. So it just kept on being difficult and being hard and being challenging and not being certain, whether or not I'd actually be able to make it. Now, everybody who was in my proximity was kind of, really stressed out by the timing and was just pushing through. And they all ended up pulling, not all, but some of them ended up pulling all-nighters on the final night and just pushing into Nome in the early morning hours in terrible, terrible conditions. And I looked at it and I said, you know what? The conditions to ski right now are really bad. It would be so much nicer if, things set up a little bit and the temperatures were colder, actually, because that would make it skiable again. So rather than pushing through the night and slogging away at, 2 miles an hour with everybody else, I'm just going to stop. I'm going to stop. I'm going to sleep. I'm going to let the temperatures do their thing. And then I'm going to start out again in the early morning hours, banking on the fact that I was going to be able to ski again because it should be colder. The trail should be better. And so I ended up bedding down and, lay down to sleep. And my gamble worked. It paid off, but it was a nail biter because I ended up finishing with just under 2 hours on the clock. And if the conditions hadn't improved and if it hadn't been skiable, then laying down for that last sleep would have made me time out.
Oh my goodness. Honestly, just an incredible achievement because you did become the first woman to ever ski, or is it first person?
I was the first woman. Now, nobody had skied the ITI 1000 within those 30 days of the race until this very year. But this year, there were 7 of us total who tried to do it, 6 men and myself. And out of the 6 men, 2 dropped out right at the beginning, and the other 4 all were able to get it done as well. So the first person ever to cross the line was this guy from Denmark, actually, Asbjørn, who tried it twice before and had gotten shut down twice before. But yeah, he finished as the first ever skier in the ITI, I believe about four or 5 days ahead of me.
Oh, but just incredible that you became the first woman to complete the ITI 1000 on skis. Just amazing, amazing. And how was your recovery? Like, how was your body? How was your mind? Like, how did you feel? Talk us through like sort of the aftermath.
I feel like I'm still right in the middle of it, to be honest. I finished at, 2 p.m. or so. And since I've been sleeping all along, I actually wasn't incredibly tired, but I thought for some reason that it was a great idea for me to book my flight straight back home. So, I finished at 2 p.m. I got one night of sleep in Nome, and then I took a flight back to Anchorage and then a red-eye flight back down to Utah, which is where I live. And it was a disaster. It was so rough because I was now so tired and the adrenaline had subsided, right? And I'm on the plane and I'm just exhausted, but I can't sleep. And that was probably the hardest part of the race, to be honest. I gave myself permission to be a bit of a slouch for the following weeks. And I feel like I'm still right in the middle of that. I've been eating a lot of donuts and, drinking wine at night. And I really haven't been working out. I haven't been trying to get back into the swing of things because I feel like my body is very cyclical in some ways. And I love being out and pushing hard, but I also give myself permission to then just, really step back and take a complete rest for a little while. Now, I have some big projects coming up, later in the year. So probably in about a week or two, I'll start getting more active again. But yeah, for the time being, I was just feet up and, back to doing the kind of screen and desk-based work. And in some ways, I really, really enjoy that balance.
Sunny, thank you so much for sharing all your amazing stories with us. Where are you most active on social media? Where can people follow along with your adventures and your challenges?
I am mostly active on Instagram, and that's my first initial last name. So that's Stroeer. And, also if you just Google my name and you Google the Iditarod, you'll find all sorts of, kind of pieces and coverage that are coming out here slowly over time. So, I try to keep it real. But since I do run 3 businesses as well, in addition to being an adventure athlete, occasionally I'll go into hibernation for a little while on social media and then catch you all up again. So if you don't see anything on there recently, it'll come.
It will come. Fantastic. Sunny, I'd love for you to have the final words of advice, final words of wisdom for other women out there who want to embrace the mountains and want to embrace the cold. They want to embrace doing very long distances. What advice would you like to share for other women who want to take on new adventures and new challenges? But please don't say just do it. Any other advice apart from that?
My advice would be that these types of adventures, in my opinion, kind of work like compound interest. And, in a way, it's just a matter of continually pushing your comfort zone just a little bit, right? 10 years ago, I could not have imagined skiing 1,000 miles through Alaska. 3 or 4 years ago, I guess I imagined skiing 1,000 miles through Alaska, and the race director said, absolutely not. And thankfully she did, because, after doing the short distance, I realized that I wasn't ready for it. However, so 2 or 3 years after I'd had the first short experience, I couldn't imagine doing 1,000 miles, but then I just kept chipping away at it and kept expanding my comfort zone, a little bit, piece by piece, here and there and here and there. And all of a sudden it's like, 1,000 miles through Alaska. Was it a big adventure? 100%. Do I think I might want to do it again someday? And is it a little bit less daunting now? Yes, 100% as well. So whatever it is on your end, whatever it is that you're working on or that you're dreaming about or whatever it may be, even if you're not there yet, just keep putting that money in the bank and, keep collecting the interest. And before you know it, you're going to be able to go and do it.
Absolutely. Sunny, thank you so much for coming back on the Tough Girl Podcast Extra. Just incredible to catch up with you. And please do keep us updated with all your future challenges and adventures.
Thank you, Sarah. Pleasure to be here.
Hey tribe, I really hope you enjoyed that Tough Girl Podcast Extra episode with Sunny. What an incredible woman, what an inspiration. Things that just come to mind, which really sort of resonated with me, is the fact that she went year after year after year. You can see the progression, you can see the journey. And that's like with any challenge. Sometimes you just see the end result and you don't see the practice trails or the practice and the training that has gone into climbing that mountain, running that race, completing that challenge. And so that's one of the things that I really loved about how Sunny shared. She talked about the progress and the learnings. And that's what it's all about. It's putting yourself out there, doing something new, doing something challenging, something that's going to take you outside your comfort zone. You're going to learn from that experience. You're going to take lessons from it, and then you're going to apply that to the next challenge and the next adventure that you take going on forward. During the episode that we obviously, we talked about that we've spoken with Sunny previously, and that episode came out on June 23rd, 2020. And in that episode, we talk more about Sunny, how she decided to leave behind the business world in order to focus full time on climbing and running mountains. We talk more about her childhood and growing up when she was looking for new adventures, making that decision to leave her corporate job. She talks more about van life, climbing Aconcagua, sexism while climbing mountains. She also shares more about the mental side of the challenge, dealing with the uncertainty, training, dealing with failure, coping with challenging days in the mountains. Again, it's a phenomenal episode. You will definitely learn something from it. So please do go back and take a listen to that first episode if you haven't already. If you visit toughgirlchallenges.com, which is basically the main central hub, the main central website, you will find more information about Sunny and also the other previous guests that we have coming on the Tough Girl podcast. This episode is being sponsored by Innovate, and you will see that I wear all of Innovate's gear when I am out on my challenges. And the next time you see me out on challenges, you're going to be seeing that I'm wearing some new gear. So I recently went up to Innovate and renovated like my Storm Shell waterproof jackets. It was so hard saying goodbye to them. And I've got a replacement Storm Shell waterproof jacket. And I've also got the most beautiful Innovate Thermo Shell Pro insulated jacket, which is absolutely stunning. Now, this jacket has actually been designed for, it's a running jacket, but I'm going to use it for through hiking. But it definitely ticks all the boxes for me. It is super, super comfortable. It's water resistant. It's windproof. And the biggest box of all, it is extremely warm. So I'm going to be taking this on my next challenge, which I'm going to be starting at the beginning of July, which is Glyndor's Way. So Glyndor's Way is a UK national trail. It's 135 miles, 217 kilometres. You start in Knighton and end in Welshpool. You can find more information about this trail by visiting nationaltrail.co.uk. But it's part of my goals to finish all of the UK national trails over the next couple of years. So I'm super excited to be taking on this challenge. I will be sharing the journey on Instagram at Tough Girl Challenges. I'll be filming it for the Tough Girl YouTube channel as well. So please do come and follow along with the journey on Instagram. If you haven't done so already, then please do go and visit the YouTube channel as well. And on the YouTube channel, you can see all of the gear that I'm wearing. You can see me wearing all of Innovate shorts, the different types of trainers that I've worn, the Storm Shell waterproof jacket, the pink mid-layer hoodie, all of the gear. If you do have any questions, then please do send me a message. Happy to answer it. You can get a 15% discount by using the discount code ToughGirl15, ToughGirl15 when you check out. You can go to Innovate's website, inov8.com, and you can check out all of their products and use the discount code ToughGirl15. Thank you again for listening to this episode. We have one more sponsored episode coming out at the end of June, on the 27th of June. We're going to be speaking to Kristen Through, who's going to be sharing more about her Tiararoa South Island adventure and also share more about some of her hikes in Europe. It is a wonderful episode and I think you will thoroughly enjoy it. Please do hit that subscribe button, and all that's left for me to say is, wherever you are, whatever you are doing, give it your all, give it 110%, get after it, go for it, believe in yourself, because I believe in you. Take care, lots of love, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye.